Hello everyone. I hope you've had your fill of silliness this week, because Halloween weekend is upon us and it's time to get serious. I am the fantasy vampire. I took on this form after doing what so few have done, and that is to win a vampire league as the vampire. So while the rest of the week's takes have been sugar-coated bullshit, what you're about to receive is the absolute best fantasy football advice from a truly powerful source. When you're finished watching this show, you'll have the knowledge that you'll need to defeat your opponent this week. So hit the like button and show the fantasy tyrant who the real lord of fantasy football advice is. Subscribe if you haven't, and perhaps I'll take over the show and this channel will become the Fantasy Vampire. So don't bother clicking on the link to the Patreon down below to sign up for one-on-one fantasy fights or to enter yourself in the giveaway for a stitched jersey of your favorite player. Let the reign of the Fantasy Vampire begin, and it starts now with
Benches and bumps, benches and bumps, benches and bumps.
And my running back bump of the week is DeAndre Swift. He should be considered an unsittable stud at this point, but you'd be surprised, or apparently not, by how many questions I get about him. After 7 weeks, he's a top 3 running back in most leagues, so this will be the last time he's mentioned on this show. I will always recommend him if you ask about him. He's scoring 19.6 fantasy points per game on the season, and this week, the Lions take on the Philadelphia Eagles, who are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So not only am I making him the bump of the week, I'm predicting that he's the top scoring running back of the week in fantasy football, and then maybe you'll never feel like you have to ask about him again. Bump him up to your starting squad and leave him there. What, you didn't like that? Too real for you because it wasn't riddled with bad language, lame puns, or dad jokes? Fine, I'll punch it up a bit with some Halloween flavor. And no, I'm not talking about pumpkin spice. Put the kiddies to bed for this one. Other running backs are bumping up. Damian Harris has been on fire the past couple weeks, like a student at Carrie's prom, blazing the field and opposing defenses for over 20 fantasy points per game in that span. This week the Patriots host the Chargers, who have been stout against the pass, but not fared well against the run, being roasted for the 5th most fantasy points against running backs. Harris finally has the trust of his coach, and is ready to set the Chargers defense aflame. I'm not worried about Brandon Bolden cutting into his carries. Harris has 14 or more carries over the past 3 weeks. Bolden will play the James White role, handling passing downs. Harris is set to burn it up this week, so bump him up to your starting squad. Chuba Hubbard didn't fare so well in the bump slot last week, but I'm giving him another chance. He hasn't exactly killed it since taking over for an injured Christian McCaffrey, but he hasn't exactly rolled over and died either. Matt Rule said that they need more explosive plays from the run and is doubling down on his commitment to get Hubbard more touches, even though game script got in the way of that last week. But this week, the Panthers faced the Atlanta Falcons, who are bottom 10 against the run in all leagues. This week I think Hubbard will get the touches he needs to clip the Falcons' wings and watch them fall to their death as he runs over them for over 100 yards and at least 1 touchdown, as he'll be knocking on the door of RB1 status.
Here's Johnny!
Bump him up. And my top sleeper at the running back position is Zach Moss. Devin Singletary definitely keeps Zach Moss's fantasy potential chained up like one of Jigsaw's victims. But remember, in week 2, the first time the Bills faced the Dolphins this season, Moss was able to escape the bindings, putting up 34 total yards and 2 touchdowns on 10 total touches. This week, the Bills play the Fins again, but this time, Moss has gained more trust and usage in the offense. And they're playing at home in what could be a nasty weather game with scattered showers in the forecast. That means that likely both teams will be dueling it out in the run game, and this could become a defensive slogfest. Miami has been brutalized by the run, allowing at least either 100 yards or a touchdown to a running back every week this season. He'd be a great flex this week. As for the benches, my top bencher running back this week is Miles Gaskin. You might think this would be a good matchup for Gaskin in what should be a defensive struggle with a lot of running. But if you start him against the Bills, who give up the second least fantasy points to opposing running backs, it might be pure misery. The good news is, when Gaskin faced the Bills earlier this season, he put up the 13th highest fantasy point total of any running back against him this season. The bad news is, that was only good for 8.6 fantasy points. This time around, they'll be playing in Buffalo with sloppy weather, which could hobble Gaskin, who is more of a pass-catching back and merely a matchup-based starter at this point. And this is not a good matchup, as the Bills are especially good at stopping pass-catching backs, so leave Gaskin on your bench. Other running backs I'm benching? No, benching Mike Davis isn't an overreaction to last week's 1-point performance. Last week was simply a reflection of Mike Davis's true floor, and his ceiling is below 14 fantasy points this season. The Atlanta Falcons are where running backs go to die. Just ask Todd Gurley. Speaking of dying, Carolina is pure death for running backs, giving up the least fantasy points to the position this season. If you weren't already contemplating benching or even dropping Mike Davis this week, then maybe you need a new hobby, like murder. But perhaps Davis is a change of pace back for Patterson at this point, so leave him on your bench. Just because Mark Ingram got traded back to the team who drafted him doesn't mean you should fire up David Johnson. Was Johnson all that great last season? No, not at all. Averaged 12 fantasy points per game in a season where he was the clear lead back. That's brutal. And while the Rams aren't all that great against the run, they'll be scoring a lot of points, and the Texans will have to pass a lot, playing from behind. Johnson's production will get swallowed up by game script. Not to mention his terrible usage already, so leave him on your bench. Bust alert. Leonard Fournette has been having a career year this season, but even he's susceptible to bad matchups. The Saints have been frustrating running backs all season, hovering right around top 5 against the rush. Plus, if the revenge game narrative reigns true, the Bucs will have to throw a lot more. Also, Ronald Jones is getting more work, carrying the ball 10 times last week, his highest touch total of the season. You aren't starting anyone but a sure thing over Lenny, but don't be surprised if he messes the bed. Now let's talk about wide receivers, and the wide receiver bump of the week this week goes to DK Metcalf. Never thought I'd be talking about him in this spot this season because I had him pegged as a stud. But backup quarterback blues has brutalized Metcalf's production. However, it hasn't completely killed it. Metcalf is still putting up double-digit fantasy points every week. And this week, he gets the Jaguars defense, who may as well be the Walking Dead. Ranking in the bottom 10 against wide receivers in all leagues. Geno Smith seems to only be able to throw the ball to Metcalf, and in a matchup this good, why not go back to that well again? Don't make mindless decisions. Bump up TK this week. Other wide receivers are bumping up. Michael Pittman has been a godsend this season and has seemingly exorcised the devil out of Carson Wentz, ending his cavalcade of crap and helping him become a somewhat solid quarterback. The connection between Wentz and Pittman is certainly turning heads. He put up his third 20-point fantasy performance last week and is a top 25 wide receiver on the season. This week, he's going to own or perhaps possess the Titans secondary, who is giving up the most fantasy points to wide receivers this season, and will likely catch a couple long bombs, maybe 1 or 2 for a touchdown. I think he breaks into the top 20, not just this week, but for the rest of the season as well. And if you're worried about T.Y. Hilton coming back and cutting into his production, don't be. Paris Campbell's still out, and there'll be plenty of targets for both Hilton and Pittman, so don't bang your head trying to figure out this one. Give Pittman a bump this week. Jarvis Landry came back from his injury before his QB Baker Mayfield and Case Keenum didn't get him the ball a lot. But now that Baker's back, and considering their connection, I see a bounce back week coming from Jarvis. The Steelers' defense is being carved up like an 80s horror movie teen to the tune of the fourth most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. And I think Landry will knife his way back through the defensive backs and score at least one, if not two, touchdowns. Fantasy owners can benefit from taking a stab at Landry this week. Bump him up. But what about your sleeper at wide receiver? Jerry Jeudy was experiencing soreness in his ankle on Friday's practice. Uh-oh. Time to go back to Tim Patrick. You know you're starting sudden, and while Tim Patrick's been solid, he doesn't have a very high ceiling. I do think he reaches that ceiling this week though, getting right around 15 fantasy points against the Washington defense, who's bleeding out the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. It could be a bloodbath for that secondary, and I see Patrick owners benefiting. Patrick is only 30% owned for some bloody reason, so go get him and start him if you need help this week. So we move on to the wide receivers I'm putting on the pine this week, and I'm not a fan of Brandon Cooks. Since TyRant Taylor went out with a hamstring injury in week 2, Cook's production has gone down significantly. He's only had double-digit targets and double-digit fantasy points twice since then. This has made Brandon Cooks owners want to scream. This week, he'll be seeing a frightening dose of Jalen Ramsey. Davis Mills will likely be looking elsewhere this week. Brandon Cooks will be a tremendous buy low candidate, as I expect his production to go back up once TyRant Taylor returns. And after this week, you should be able to get him for next to nothing. If you own him though, better weeks will come, but this week, leave Brandon Cooks on your bench. Other wide receivers I'm benching. T. Higgins finally had a decent game since coming back from injury last week. And while I think he'll have even better weeks down the road, this week, I think he takes a wrong turn. When you think New York Jets, you think soft matchup, but against opposing wide receivers, that's not been true. They are the worst team against the run, but top 3 against opposing wide receivers in fantasy. Presumably because the team facing them can just run on them the whole game, and they rarely have to turn to the pass. Even though T. Higgins was a target monster last week with 15 targets, 5 more than Jamar Chase, he caught 1 less pass than Chase and had a lot less production. Higgins will be fine in better matchups, but don't fall into a hole thinking of the Jets as a good one. This week, if you have other decent options, leave Higgins on your bench. And yeah, fine, I'll be the first one to do it. I'll have the guts to tell you to bench Allen Robinson for this game, if not indefinitely. And in doing so, the fantasy gods will likely allow him his first good game of the season. So while I make this prediction, this time I'm telling you to listen at your own risk. We've stuck with him for weeks, and hopefully he gets traded before the deadline. But in fantasy right now, he's almost droppable. The 49ers have given up the 12 fewest fantasy points to wide receivers and have faced some pretty good sets like the Cardinals, Seahawks, and Packers. Darnell Mooney is Fields' guy, and in fact, it's been suggested that Fields didn't get as many reps with Robinson as he did with Mooney in preseason, since he was playing behind Andy Dalton. Robinson will likely get better as Fields gets better, but Fields isn't there yet. So in a gruesome matchup, you'd be best off leaving A-Rob on your bench. Bust alert, DJ Moore's season has gone as Sam Darnold as their production seems to mirror one another. And right now, the reflection is frightening. Darnold has been off target, and that's translated into Moore catching only 11 of 23 targets the past couple of weeks. And while they do have a seemingly good matchup against the Falcons, and this could be a get-right game, it could just as well be a disaster. Good matchups only work when the team is playing well enough to exploit it. And that's not happening right now. I'm not saying sit DJ Moore, I'm just saying maybe not fire him up in DFS, as it could be a trap play. And if you're stacked at wide receiver, you might consider safer options until things turn back around. Moving on to quarterbacks, and the quarterback bump of the week goes to Matthew Stafford. And this is another example of if they have a great week again, I'm not talking about them on the show. If you have them, you're starting them every week. And I'm confident that I won't have to mention him here again, because this week, against Houston, it's set up to be a Texans chainsaw massacre. Stafford will slice up the Houston secondary with some deep cuts to Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, and Van Jefferson. Maybe even D-Jax to drive up his price for a trade before the deadline. Expect a Matt Stafford slaughter this week, so give him a bump to your starting roster permanently and trade whoever else you have to pick up some help at another position. Other QBs are bumping up. Kirk Cousins started the season off strong, then a couple of bad weeks and everyone doubting him. But in week 6, he silenced the doubters with his best performance of the season against the stout Panthers team. And with 2 whole weeks to prepare, the Vikings get to feast on the fantasy point fiesta that is the Dallas Cowboys.
They're eating her. And then they're going to eat me. Oh my God!
The Cowboys are giving up the 5th most fantasy points to QBs, and with his full arsenal healthy and at full force, I expect a big game from Captain Kirk, so give him a bump this week. And the QB sleeper of the week is Teddy Bridgewater. It's no secret that the Washington defense has been a major bust this season, but what you may not realize is that Bridgewater has been quietly good as a matchup-based QB in fantasy, playing well in plus matchups. Predictable QB production is a valuable asset in fantasy, so if you find yourself without a quarterback this week, pick up Teddy. The Washington team is giving up the most fantasy points to opposing QBs this season, so don't be afraid to give TB5 a shot. Now for the QBs I'm benching. Trevor Lawrence has gotten better as the season has progressed, and Seattle's D has not been the immovable object that they've been in the past. But don't get caught up in that trap, or you'll be trying to find a way out of a hole.
Put the fucking lotion in the basket!
The Seahawks D has rapidly improved as they've gotten healthier and acclimated to the season. They are now more middle of the pack against opposing QBs and getting better week by week. And this week at home against the rookie QB Lawrence, and with the 12th man behind them, the Seattle D will eat Lawrence up. So keep Lawrence silent this week on your bench. Another QB going to the pine. Tua has put up a couple good weeks in a row. Time to start him again, right? Wrong. Do that this week against the Bills, and you could be doomed for failure.
You're doomed. 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 You're doomed. Doomed.
Heads will roll if you make that mistake this week, as the Bills are giving up the least fantasy points to QBs. Tua's playing better, but he's still a matchup-based starter at best. On the road, in rainy weather, against a scary defense, don't bend over backwards trying to fit Tua into your plans this week. Leave him on your bench. Bust alert. Sam Darnold went from surprise fantasy stud to surprise fantasy dud. And it was so sudden, it makes one wonder what happened. Maybe he's seeing ghosts again.
I see dead people.
So while this matchup with Atlanta seems good on paper, we may see an M. Night Shyamalan-like twist. It's hard to trust Darnold's volatile production this season. So while it could be a get-right game, it could also be a trap. If he has a good game in this one, we can start to trust him in good matchups again. But is it worth the risk? That's for you to decide. And finally, the tight ends, and my tight end bump of the week is Hunter Henry. Because not only is he Mac Jones' security blanket, but the tight end position seems to be the Chargers' Achilles heel. They give up the second most fantasy points to the position. Personally, as a vampire, I don't like talking about hunters. Makes me think of Van Helsing. Ooh, curse that name. But this hunter doesn't frighten me this week. In fact, I see another top 10 tight end week from the guy. Something in the range of 5 catches for 53 yards and a touchdown, so give him a bump this week. Other tight ends I'm bumping up. Dallas Goedert continues to have a good season when he's on the field. And even better now that he's free of Zach Ertz. And while the Philadelphia Eagles offense is as unpredictable as a really good horror movie ending, the Detroit Lions D is as predictable as a really bad horror movie ending. They're really bad, And even though they aren't necessarily giving up a lot to tight ends, they haven't faced many of note outside of Mark Andrews and George Kittle, who both had good games against them. They give up whatever the offense likes, and Hurts likes to throw to Goddard. Simple enough. Give him a bump this week. As for your tight end sleeper, yeah, this is a scary one, so I don't blame you if you don't do it. But Ingram did have 8 targets last week, and Kansas City is weak against tight ends, giving it up to Michael Pruitt last week. Even so, it is the Giants, and it is Evan Ingram, so I don't blame you for being a little bit afraid to start him. But in a game Danny Dimes is likely going to need a throw-in, facing the defense giving up the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. If you're in a bind, there are worse options. That's about as good of an endorsement as you're gonna get from me on this guy, so do with that what you will. And as for who I'm benching, here's a shocking twist for you. Dalton Schultz. I know he's been a revelation this season, but I'm worried about this game for him. For one thing, the Vikings are a top 10 defense against tight ends, having held all but 2 tight ends to around 5 fantasy points or fewer. And while they haven't faced the who's who of tight ends, they did hold TJ Hawkinson to 4.2 fantasy points. Also, Michael might be back. Michael Gallup, I mean. I heard mixed reports on the subject, but even if he isn't back, I'm still worried about Schultz this week. If Gallup is still out, you might start him if you have no other option. But if Gallup plays, you better leave Schultz on your bench. Another tight end I'm benching this week is Mo Alley Cox. He's been serviceable as a touchdown-dependent tight end, but that's why I'm benching him this week. He's unlikely to score against the Titans, who are allowing the 5th least fantasy points to tight ends. He hasn't received any more than 5 targets or caught any more than 3 of them this season. Low targets, low volume, touchdown-dependent, facing a top 5 defense against tight ends? Sounds like the worst recipe since Soylent Green.
Soylent Green is made out of people.
Silent Green is people!
Sorry for the spoiler, just assume you haven't lived under a rock your whole life. But anyway, leave Mo Alley Cox on your bench. Bust alert, since putting up a goose egg in week 1, Mike Gesicki has only gone below 16 fantasy points in PPR twice. Impressive. But he may do it a 3rd time this week against the oft-mentioned stout Bills defense. They rank in the top 10 at preventing tight ends from putting up fantasy points. And with the possibility of rainy weather on the road, it may just be a really low-scoring, grind-it-out kind of game. That might benefit Gesicki, but it might hurt him too. Although a lack of other options might make me scared. Ha! Gotcha! Not a horror movie this time. Thought I'd change it up and end on a lighter note. So there it is, folks. And make sure to hit up the Fantasy Tyrant on Facebook or in the comments below for answers to your burning questions. Or better yet, come see whoever the special guest host is tomorrow morning for the live Halloween edition of the Tinker Stinker Power Hour. That starts at 8:30 a.m. Pacific, 11:30 a.m. Eastern, right here on this channel. He'll go over deep sleepers, streaming defenses and kickers, up-to-the-minute injury updates, weather reports, and answer all your questions as you're taking your morning dump and setting your lineup. Talk about scary. So until then, please hit like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Goodbye, good luck, and have a happy Halloween. Ha 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 ha.
Oh, God damn it.